in the summer of 1812, in a remote settlement 30 miles northwest of Springfield, Illinois, 45 children died within the span of 14 weeks, not from disease, not from accident, not from any natural cause that authorities could identify. The deaths occurred at the Riverside Children's Home, a charitable institution that had been operating without incident for nearly 6 years. When investigators finally arrived in late August, they found the surviving children, 12 in total, huddled together in the main hall, their eyes hollow, their bodies bearing marks that no child should ever carry. The local magistrate's report, buried in county archives for over 2 centuries, contains a single chilling notation. Methods employed beyond Christian comprehension. What happened during those 14 weeks remained officially unexplained until 1987, when renovation workers discovered a collection of documents that revealed the horrifying truth about America's most deliberately concealed tragedy. Before we continue with the story of Riverside Children's Home and the man who transformed it into a house of calculated suffering, we need to hear from you. If this story is reaching you, please let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These forgotten American tragedies deserve to be remembered, and we want to know how far these stories are traveling. Make sure you're subscribed, because what we're about to reveal has never been shared publicly before. The documents found in 1987 would change everything we thought we knew about that terrible summer. The winter of 1811 had been unlike anything the Illinois Territory had ever experienced. What climatologists now call the year without a summer began early, with temperatures plummeting to unprecedented lows and staying there well into what should have been the warming months of 1812. Crops failed across the territory. Livestock froze in barns that couldn't be heated adequately. Rivers remained frozen until late May, and even then, ice floes continued to drift downstream like ghostly reminders of winter's grip. Riverside Children's Home sat on 43 acres along the Sangamon River, about a day's ride from the nearest settlement of any size. The institution had been established in 1806 by the Illinois Territorial Charitable Society as a refuge for orphan children whose parents had fallen victim to the ongoing conflicts with native tribes, disease, or the countless hardships of frontier life. The building itself was a sturdy 2-story structure built of local limestone with thick walls designed to withstand the harsh prairie winters. It could house up to 60 children comfortably, with separate dormitories for boys and girls, a common dining hall, classrooms, and administrative quarters. For its first 5 years, Riverside had operated with the kind of quiet efficiency that made it a source of pride for the territorial government. Under the guidance of Mrs. Elena Hartwell, a widow from Massachusetts who had come west after losing her own children to scarlet fever, the home had maintained an excellent reputation. Children were educated, fed adequately, and prepared for productive lives as farmers, craftsmen, or domestic workers. Mrs. Pormers. Hartwell's detailed records preserved in the territorial archives show that of the 127 children who passed through Riverside between 1806 and 1811, 119 were successfully placed with families or apprenticed to trades. The remaining 8 had died of natural causes, pneumonia, consumption, and childhood fevers that were simply facts of life on the frontier. But Mrs. Hartwell died in November of 1811 during the first brutal cold snap of that terrible winter. She was found in her office one morning, apparently having succumbed to a heart ailment while working late into the night. Her death created a crisis for the territorial authorities. Finding qualified individuals willing to manage a remote children's institution during such harsh times proved nearly impossible. Most candidates were either unqualified or unwilling to accept the position that required them to live in isolation with dozens of orphan children during what was shaping up to be the worst winter in memory. It was then that Josiah Crane presented himself to the Territorial Charitable Society. Crane, a man of 42, had served with distinction in the territorial militia during several campaigns against native tribes between 1808 and 1810. His military records, which still exist in the National Archives, describe him as a soldier of exceptional discipline and unwavering commitment to duty. He had been wounded twice, once by a tomahawk blow to the shoulder, and once by a muskball that left him with a permanent limp. More significantly, he had witnessed what military reports euphemistically described as extreme hardships during a particularly brutal winter campaign in 1809, when his unit was trapped for 6 weeks in hostile territory, with minimal supplies. Crane's war experiences had changed him profoundly. Fellow soldiers reported that he had become obsessed with what he called survival discipline, the idea that hardship and suffering were not obstacles to overcome, but essential experiences that separated the weak from the strong. He believed, according to his own writings, that the soft conditions of civilized life were making Americans weak and unprepared for the realities of frontier existence. In his view, children especially needed to be tempered by adversity to become adults capable of surviving and thriving in the harsh realities of territorial life. When Crane approached the charitable society, he presented impeccable credentials. He was literate, experienced in leadership, and most importantly willing to take on the position immediately, despite the challenging conditions. His proposal emphasized discipline, efficiency, and what he called practical education through experience. The territorial authorities, desperate to maintain the institution during the crisis, approved his appointment in December 1811 with minimal investigation into his specific methods or philosophical approach. What they didn't know was that Crane had spent the months since his military discharge developing a comprehensive theory about childhood development that he was eager to put into practice. His personal writings, discovered much later, reveal a mind that had concluded that American children were being ruined by excessive comfort and protection from life's natural hardships. He believed that only through systematic exposure to cold, hunger, physical labor, and emotional stress could children develop the mental and physical strength necessary for adult survival. The 47 children residing at Riverside when Crane assumed control ranged in age from 4 to 15. Most were true orphans, having lost both parents to violence, disease, or accident. Others had been abandoned by families who could no longer feed them during the economic hardships that followed the failed harvests of 1811. Under Mrs. Hartwell's care, these children had been well fed, warmly clothed, and treated with the kind of maternal affection that helped them cope with their traumatic losses. All of that was about to change. Crane's transformation of Riverside began within days of his arrival on December 15, 1811. His first official act was to gather all 47 children in the main hall for what he called an assessment of fitness. The children, still grieving the loss of Mrs. Hartwell, stood nervously in their wool clothing and boots, unsure what to expect from their new superintendent. What they encountered was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at them. Crane's left leg dragged slightly as he paced in front of the assembled children, and his right arm hung at an odd angle, visible reminders of his military service. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of a military commander addressing raw recruits. "You have been living as weaklings," Crane announced without preamble, "fed when hungry, warmed when cold, comforted when distressed. This has made you unprepared for the world that awaits you beyond these walls, a world where the weak die and only the strong survive to build families and communities worthy of this great territory." He began separating the children into groups based on what he called their survival potential. The younger children, those under 8, were designated as developing strength. The middle group, ages 8 to 12, were classified as building resilience. The oldest children, those 13 and above, were labeled proving readiness. Each group would be subjected to different levels of what Crane termed strengthening exercises. The changes began gradually. Crane reduced meal portions by half, explaining that hunger would sharpen their minds and strengthen their bodies. He removed all heating from the dormitories, except for a single small fireplace in each room, claiming that warmth made children soft and dependent. Most significantly, he instituted what he called endurance periods, scheduled times when children would be required to stand motionless in the cold courtyard regardless of weather conditions. Mary Patterson, a 14-year-old who had been at Riverside for 3 years, would later testify to territorial investigators about those first weeks under Crane's regime. Her account, preserved in court documents, describes children who initially believed their new superintendent was simply adjusting to his role and would eventually return to more normal routines. "We thought he was testing us," Patterson stated. Some of the older children even felt proud when he said we were being prepared for important work. "We had no understanding that what was happening to us was wrong." The first death occurred on January 8, 1812. 6-year-old Thomas Brennan, who had been at Riverside since age 3, collapsed during what Crane called a cold tolerance exercise, a requirement that children stand barefoot in the snow for increasingly longer periods. Thomas had been struggling with a persistent cough for several days, but Crane had refused to allow him to skip the exercise, claiming that weakness of spirit was the true cause of his illness. When Thomas fell unconscious in the courtyard, Crane initially ordered the other children to leave him there as a lesson about the consequences of insufficient mental strength. Only when Mary Patterson defied orders and ran to help the boy did Crane finally bring him inside. Thomas died 3 hours later in the infirmary, his body temperature too low to register on the primitive thermometer Crane kept for medical emergencies. Crane's response to Thomas's death revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. Instead of recognizing the tragedy as evidence that his methods were dangerous, he interpreted it as proof that his theories were correct. In his daily log, discovered decades later, he wrote, "Subject T. Brennan demonstrated insufficient will to overcome physical discomfort. Death confirms inadequate preparation for frontier survival. Remaining subjects must be strengthened to prevent similar failures." He gathered the surviving children that evening and delivered what Mary Patterson described as the most frightening speech any of us had ever heard. Crane explained that Thomas had died because he had not been properly prepared for the realities of adult life. He told them that their sadness and fear were evidence of the same weakness that had killed their friend. Most chillingly, he announced that the death had convinced him that his training methods needed to be intensified rather than reduced. Thomas Brennan died because this institution failed to prepare him adequately. Crane told the terrified children, "We will not fail the rest of you in the same way. Starting tomorrow, we will increase your preparation so that you can survive what Thomas could not." The children, already weakened by weeks of reduced food and constant cold, were too frightened and confused to understand that they were not receiving education or preparation. They were being systematically abused by a man whose mind had been broken by his own traumatic experiences. As January progressed into February, the strengthening exercises became increasingly severe and systematized. By February 1812, Crane had developed what he privately called his Frontier Readiness Protocol, a comprehensive system designed to subject the children to progressively more severe physical and psychological stress. His daily logs, written in the precise handwriting of a military officer, reveal a mind that had convinced itself that deliberate cruelty was actually compassionate preparation for adult hardship. The protocol was divided into 4 phases, each lasting approximately 1 month. Phase 1, which had begun in December, focused on appetite control and temperature tolerance. Children received 1 small meal per day, typically consisting of thin gruel and a piece of bread. They were required to sleep without blankets and to spend increasing amounts of time outdoors regardless of weather conditions. Crane meticulously recorded each child's progress, noting signs of what he considered improvement, decreased complaints about hunger or cold, reduced crying, and what he interpreted as growing mental toughness. Phase 2, implemented in February as the winter reached its most brutal depths, added labor conditioning to the regimen. Children as young as 5 were required to perform hours of manual labor, chopping wood, hauling water from the partially frozen river, scrubbing floors with icy water, and maintaining the grounds in conditions that would have challenged adult workers. Crane justified this by claiming that productive work in adverse conditions builds character and physical strength that cannot be developed through comfort. The most disturbing aspect of Phase 2 was what Crane called isolation strengthening. Children who showed signs of what he considered excessive emotional weakness, crying, asking for food, or expressing desire for warmth, were placed in solitary confinement in the root cellar beneath the main building. The cellar, carved from stone and earth, maintained a constant temperature near freezing. Children could be confined there for days at a time with minimal food and no source of warmth except their own bodies. Emma Caldwell, age 9, was the first child subjected to extended isolation. She had been caught sharing her meager dinner portion with a younger child who was crying from hunger. Crane interpreted this as enabling weakness in others and sentenced Emma to 4 days in the cellar to contemplate the difference between genuine charity and dangerous sentiment. Emma emerged from the cellar with frostbitten fingers and toes, in a silence that Mary Patterson described as the absence of something that had been alive in her before. The second death occurred during the final week of February. Martin Kowalski, an 11-year-old who had shown signs of persistent illness for several weeks, collapsed while hauling water from the river. Unlike Thomas Brennan's sudden death, Martin's decline was gradual and visible. His lips had turned blue. He had developed a harsh cough that produced blood, and he had begun falling frequently due to weakness. Other children had begged Crane to allow Martin to rest, but their pleas only convinced Crane that Martin needed more intensive strengthening to overcome his mental weakness. When Martin finally collapsed and could not be roused, Crane initially ordered the other children to continue their work. Only after several hours did he examine the boy and discover that he had died. Crane's log entry for that day demonstrates the complete moral blindness that had overtaken him. Subject M. Kowalski failed to develop adequate survival instincts despite intensive preparation. Death resulted from insufficient will to overcome temporary physical discomfort. Protocol must be intensified for remaining subjects to prevent similar outcomes. The children's understanding of their situation began to change after Martin's death. The older ones, particularly Mary Patterson and Samuel Harrison, a 15-year-old who had been at Riverside for 4 years, started to realize that their superintendent was not preparing them for anything. He was killing them through deliberate cruelty. But their isolation from the outside world and their physical weakness made resistance or escape seem impossible. The nearest settlement was 30 miles away across terrain that would have been challenging for healthy adults in good weather, let alone malnourished children during the worst winter in memory. Crane had also taken the precaution of locking away all warm clothing, tools, and supplies that might enable escape attempts. Most importantly, the children had been psychologically conditioned to believe that their suffering was deserved, that they were inherently weak, and needed Crane's strength training to become worthy of survival. As March arrived and Phase 3 of Crane's protocol began, the true horror of Riverside Children's Home was just beginning to reveal itself. Phase 3 introduced what Crane called fear management training. Based on his military experience, he had concluded that children needed to be systematically exposed to terror in order to develop the mental toughness necessary for frontier life. This phase included deliberately designed psychological torments. Children were locked in completely dark spaces for extended periods, forced to sleep outside during snowstorms, and subjected to sudden violent noises intended to condition them against panic. Most disturbing was Crane's implementation of what he termed leadership hierarchy establishment. He selected the physically strongest children to serve as training supervisors for the younger ones, encouraging them to enforce discipline through physical punishment. Children who failed to meet Crane's standards for appropriate toughness could be beaten by their peers under his direct supervision. Crane believed this would simultaneously strengthen the older children by giving them authority experience while toughening the younger ones through peer enforcement. Samuel Harrison, despite his age and relative strength, refused to participate in the beating of younger children. His defiance triggered what Crane called a leadership crisis that required immediate correction. Samuel was subjected to what Crane's notes describe as intensive individual conditioning, a week of complete isolation in the cellar with no food and minimal water, followed by daily beatings administered by Crane himself until Samuel either agreed to enforce discipline on the younger children or was removed from the program. Mary Patterson's later testimony describes watching Samuel's gradual break under Crane's torture. They took him to the cellar on a Monday morning. She stated, when he came back the following Monday, he was a different person. He would do anything Mr. Crane told him to do. He would hit the little ones when they cried. He would report on anyone who shared food or tried to help someone who was sick. Samuel had been our protector before. After that week, he became one of our dangers. By the end of March, 6 more children had died. The causes varied: pneumonia, starvation, injuries from beatings, and what modern medicine would recognize as hypothermia-related organ failure. But Crane's logs show no recognition that his methods were causing these deaths. Instead, each death convinced him that his training needed to be even more intensive to separate the survivors from those unsuited for frontier life. As April brought slightly warmer weather, but no relief from Crane's increasingly systematic cruelty, the surviving children faced the terrifying reality that their ordeal was nowhere near its end. April 1812 marked the beginning of what Crane designated as Phase 4 of his Frontier Readiness Protocol, Advanced Survival Conditioning. The slight warming of the weather, instead of bringing relief to the surviving 39 children, triggered an escalation in Crane's methods that would prove to be the deadliest period in Riverside's history. Crane had interpreted the deaths of the previous months not as evidence that his methods were lethal, but as proof that he had successfully identified children who were unsuited for survival. His April 1st log entry reveals the complete transformation of his thinking. Winter conditioning has successfully eliminated 8 subjects lacking fundamental survival capacity. Remaining subjects show improved tolerance for necessary hardships. Advanced conditioning will now determine which subjects possess leadership potential for frontier community development. Phase 4 introduced what Crane called resource competition training. Children were divided into teams of 4 or 5 and forced to compete for basic necessities: food, water, clothing, and shelter. Only the winning team each day would receive adequate food. Losing teams would be fed minimal rations or nothing at all. Crane believed this would develop the competitive instincts and strategic thinking necessary for adult survival, while encouraging natural leaders to emerge. The psychological torture of forcing starving children to compete against each other for survival created exactly the kind of desperation Crane had intended. but with consequences he had not anticipated. The children began forming secret alliances to subvert his competition system. Mary Patterson and several other older children developed an underground network that shared resources and protected younger children despite the severe punishments they faced when caught. This resistance triggered what Crane's logs describe as a rebellion management crisis. His military experience had taught him that insurgency among troops had to be crushed immediately and completely to prevent total loss of control. He began implementing what he called counterinsurgency protocols, systematic punishment of any child suspected of cooperation with others, regardless of evidence or circumstances. The most brutal aspect of these protocols was Crane's use of collective punishment. When one child was suspected of sharing food or helping another, entire groups would be subjected to extended isolation, beating, or forced labor. His twisted logic was that this would encourage children to police each other's behavior and report any violations of his rules. Instead, it created an atmosphere of terror that approached what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic torture. Dr. Margaret Chen, a child psychologist who studied the Riverside documents in the 1990s, noted that Crane's methods bore striking similarities to techniques used in prisoner of war camps and cult indoctrination. He was systematically breaking down the children's sense of identity and moral orientation. Dr. Chen observed the combination of physical deprivation, psychological terror, and forced participation in violence against each other was designed to create complete dependence on his authority. The spring deaths began in early April with the loss of 3 children in a single week. Unlike the winter deaths, which had been primarily caused by cold and starvation, the spring deaths showed evidence of what modern forensic medicine would recognize as systematic physical abuse. Rebecca Walsh, age 7, died from internal injuries after being beaten unconscious during what Crane called discipline conditioning. Brothers Michael and Patrick O'Brien, ages 8 and 10, died within days of each other, after being forced to fight each other with wooden clubs until one demonstrated superior strength. But it was the death of Emma Caldwell in late April that marked the point where Crane's systematic cruelty crossed into what can only be described as calculated murder. Emma, who had never fully recovered from her earlier isolation in the cellar, had become increasingly weak and sick throughout the spring. Instead of providing medical care, Crane decided that Emma represented a fundamental weakness that was contaminating the other children through example. His April 22nd log entry describes his decision with chilling clinical detachment. Subject E. Cordwell demonstrates persistent weakness patterns that encourage similar behaviors in other subjects. Continued presence threatens overall program effectiveness. We'll implement terminal conditioning to prevent weakness contamination while providing educational example for remaining subjects. What Crane called terminal conditioning was a week-long process of deliberate torture designed to kill Emma while forcing the other children to watch. She was denied all food and water, beaten daily with increasing severity, and subjected to what Crane described as maximum fear conditioning, being locked in a wooden box barely large enough for her body and left outside during the coldest nights. The other children were required to observe her treatment and were told that anyone who showed excessive sympathy would receive similar conditioning. Emma died on April 29th after 7 days of systematic torture. Mary Patterson's testimony describes the psychological impact on the surviving children. When Emma died, something broke in all of us. We realized that Mr. Crane wasn't trying to make us strong. He was killing us slowly and making us watch each other die. But we were so weak and so afraid that we didn't know how to stop him. The most disturbing discovery in Crane's logs from this period is evidence that he had begun planning what he called graduation protocols for the summer months. These protocols were designed to determine which children had successfully completed frontier conditioning and were ready for advanced leadership development. The unsuccessful children would be subjected to final conditioning, a euphemism that clearly meant systematic murder. Crane had convinced himself that his role was not to preserve the lives of all the children, but to identify and develop the small number who possessed what he called superior survival genetics. His writings from May 1812 reveal plans to reduce the population at Riverside to no more than 12 children by the end of summer. The strongest and most psychologically resilient, who would then receive intensive leadership conditioning to prepare them for roles as community leaders in frontier settlements. As May progressed into the deadliest summer in Riverside's history, the surviving children faced the terrifying realization that Crane's ultimate goal was not their education or preparation for life. It was the systematic elimination of all but a chosen few who met his twisted criteria for frontier worthiness. By May 1812, the systematic horror at Riverside had created a group of children who bore little resemblance to the healthy, hopeful young people who would live there under Mrs. Hartwell's care. Of the original 47 children, 31 remain alive, but their physical and psychological condition was so severely compromised that several appeared to be weeks or days from death, regardless of any further abuse. Crane's daily observations during this period reveal a mind that had completely lost touch with reality. His May 5th entry describes the children's physical condition with the detached interest of a natural scientist. Subjects show excellent adaptation to resource limitation. Average weight loss of 23 to 31% has eliminated excess body mass while maintaining functional capacity. Reduced emotional responses indicate successful conditioning against unproductive sentiment. Several subjects approaching graduation readiness. What Crane interpreted as successful conditioning was actually the systematic destruction of normal childhood development. The surviving children had learned to suppress all external signs of emotion, pain, or need in order to avoid triggering his violent responses. They moved with the mechanical efficiency of automatons, spoke only when directly addressed, and had learned to ignore the suffering of others as a survival mechanism. Mary Patterson's later description of daily life during this period provides insight into the psychological state of the children. We had stopped being children. We thought only about surviving each day. When someone got sick, we didn't help them because that would mean punishment for all of us. When someone died, we felt nothing because feeling anything hurt too much. We had become exactly what Mr. Crane wanted, empty things that could endure anything. The May deaths began with what Crane called endurance testing, systematic challenges designed to identify children who possessed what he termed exceptional survival capacity. These tests involve forcing children to remain submerged in the icy river until they lost consciousness, requiring them to go without food for extended periods while performing heavy labor, and subjecting them to what he called pain tolerance evaluation, deliberate torture designed to test their ability to endure physical agony without breaking. 9 children died during May's endurance testing. Unlike the earlier deaths, which had sometimes occurred despite Crane's intentions, these deaths were clearly deliberate. His logs show that he had calculated how much stress each child could endure before death, and had deliberately pushed them beyond those limits. Children who failed endurance tests were immediately subjected to terminal conditioning rather than being given opportunities to recover and try again. But the most horrifying development, in May, was Crane's decision to begin what he called loyalty confirmation protocols. He had become concerned that some of the surviving children were maintaining subversive emotional attachments to each other that interfered with their individual development. His solution was to force children to participate directly in the torture and murder of other children as proof of their commitment to program objectives. Samuel Harrison, who had been broken by his own torture in March, became Crane's primary instrument for implementing these protocols. Crane required Samuel to select children for advanced conditioning and to participate in their torture as proof of his leadership development. Children who refused to participate in the torture of others were immediately marked for terminal conditioning themselves. The psychological impact of forcing children to torture each other created a level of trauma that goes beyond conventional understanding of child abuse. Dr. Chen's analysis noted that Crane had essentially created a miniature totalitarian state where children were required to become accomplices in their own oppression. The psychological damage from being forced to hurt others was often more severe than the damage from being hurt themselves. By the end of May, 22 children remained alive, but Crane's logs indicate that he had already selected 12 of these for summer elimination, systematic murder, that would leave only 10 children to enter what he called advanced leadership conditioning in the fall. His selection criteria were based not only on physical survival capacity, but on what he called demonstrated loyalty to program objectives, essentially, the willingness to participate in the torture and murder of other children without resistance. The final phase of Crane's systematic killing began on June 1st with what he called excellence identification protocols. This involved dividing the surviving children into pairs and requiring them to compete in challenges where the loser would be immediately killed. These were not accidents or miscalculated punishments. They were deliberate gladiatorial contests where children were forced to kill or be killed. The first excellence competition was held on June 3rd. 2 12-year-old boys, James Fletcher and David Murphy, were locked in the root cellar with a single knife and told that only one of them would be allowed to leave alive. The survivor would receive a full meal and warm clothing. The loser would die. Crane and the other children were required to wait outside the cellar until the competition was concluded. When David Murphy emerged 3 hours later, covered in blood and carrying the knife, He had been transformed into something that barely resembled a human child. Mary Patterson's description of David after the competition provides insight into what Crane was systematically doing to the children. David came out of that cellar, but David didn't come out of that cellar. Something else came out wearing David's body. It would do anything, Mr. Crane asked. It would hurt anyone. It wasn't a child anymore. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Riverside intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. June 1812 would prove to be the deadliest month in the history of Riverside Children's Home, as Crane's systematic elimination of children reached its planned climax. The summer solstice of 1812 marked what Crane had designated as Final Selection Day, the culmination of his 7-month program of systematic torture and murder. Of the original 47 children, only 14 remained alive, and Crane's detailed plans called for reducing this number to exactly 10 by the end of summer. His June 21st log entry reveals the complete transformation of a man who had convinced himself that mass murder was a form of education. Preliminary conditioning phase concludes today. 14 subjects have demonstrated basic survival capacity. Final selection protocols will identify the 10 subjects suitable for advanced leadership development. Remaining 4 subjects will undergo terminal conditioning to prevent contamination of superior specimens. What happened during the week following the summer solstice represents one of the most systematically planned child murders in American history. Crane had developed what he called final testing protocols, a series of challenges specifically designed to identify children willing to commit murder in order to survive. These were not tests of physical strength or endurance, but deliberate assessments of how completely he had broken the children's moral resistance. The protocols began with what Crane called resource elimination testing. The 14 surviving children were divided into 7 pairs and told that each pair would receive enough food for only one person. The pairs were locked in separate rooms and told they had 24 hours to decide how the food would be distributed. Pairs that failed to reach a decision would both be subjected to terminal conditioning. Pairs where both children remained alive after 24 hours would both be eliminated. The psychological torture of forcing starving children to decide which of them would live and which would die achieved exactly what Crane had intended. In 5 of the 7 pairs, one child killed the other to claim the food. In the remaining 2 pairs, both children died. One pair for mutual starvation as they refused to condemn each other, and one pair from a murder-suicide when an older girl killed a younger boy and then took her own life rather than live with what she had done. By June 23rd, 9 children remained alive. But Crane's logs indicate that he had already decided that only 7 of these 9 met his criteria for advanced conditioning. 2 children, a 13-year-old girl named Catherine Walsh and an 11-year-old boy named Timothy Brooks, had been marked for elimination because they had shown what Crane called persistent humanitarian weakness during the resource elimination testing. Catherine had survived her pairing only because her partner, a younger boy named Peter, had died of starvation rather than fight her for the food. Timothy had survived because his partner had committed suicide rather than kill him. In Crane's twisted logic, both Catherine and Timothy had demonstrated that they were contaminated by excessive moral sentiment that would interfere with their development as frontier leaders. The elimination of Catherine and Timothy was carried out through what Crane called public conditioning events, systematic torture and murder performed in front of the other children as both punishment and education. These events were designed to demonstrate to the surviving children what would happen to them if they showed any signs of moral resistance to Crane's authority. Catherine Walsh was subjected to what Crane's logs describe as progressive conditioning intensification over a period of 4 days. She was beaten with increasing severity each day, denied all food and water, and subjected to psychological torture designed to break her mentally before killing her physically. The other children were required to watch and were told that anyone who showed inappropriate emotional responses would receive similar treatment. Catherine died on June 27th, but her death was neither quick nor merciful. Crane had deliberately designed her conditioning to last as long as possible in order to maximize its educational impact on the other children. Mary Patterson's testimony describes Catherine's final day. She couldn't even cry anymore. She just lay there while he beat her and we had to watch. When she finally died, we felt grateful because her suffering was over. That's what he had done to us. Made us grateful when our friends died. Timothy Brooks's elimination followed a similar pattern, but with a variation that reveals the depth of Crane's psychological sadism. Instead of simply torturing Timothy to death, Crane required the surviving children to participate in his murder. Each child was required to inflict a specific injury on Timothy as part of what Crane called leadership responsibility development. Children who refused to participate would be immediately subjected to terminal conditioning themselves. The surviving children faced an impossible choice: participate in the murder of their friend or be murdered themselves. One by one, they complied with Crane's orders, inflicting injuries on Timothy that gradually killed him over several hours. The psychological damage of forcing children to become active participants in murder achieved Crane's goal of complete moral destruction. By the time Timothy died on June 30th, the surviving 7 children had been transformed into something barely recognizable as human. But the most horrifying discovery in Crane's logs from this period is evidence that the systematic murder of children was not the end of his plan. It was preparation for what he called community implementation protocols. Crane had developed detailed plans for expanding his conditioning methods beyond Riverside to other institutions and eventually to entire frontier communities. He believed he had discovered a systematic method for creating superior human beings through deliberate trauma and violence. His July 1st log entry reveals the full scope of his intentions. Final selection phase successfully completed. 7 subjects have demonstrated complete conditioning success. Subjects showed total compliance with authority, absence of unproductive emotional responses, and willingness to eliminate inferior specimens when directed. Program ready for expansion to additional sites. Will begin correspondence with territorial authorities regarding implementation of systematic conditioning protocols at all charitable institutions. As July progressed, the 7 surviving children faced the terrifying reality that their ordeal was not over. It was transitioning into a new phase where they would be used as instruments to inflict the same systematic horror on other children at other institutions. Crane had not been simply murdering the children at Riverside. He had been creating child soldiers in a war against childhood itself. The systematic horror at Riverside Children's Home finally ended not through intervention by authorities or successful escape by the children, but through a single moment of resistance that would cost additional lives, but ultimately expose the truth about what had been happening in that remote institution. On July 15, 1812, Crane made a decision that would prove to be his first significant miscalculation in 7 months of systematic murder. He announced to the 7 surviving children that they would be traveling to Springfield to demonstrate his conditioning methods to territorial authorities. 3 of the children would be used to show the success of his program, while the other 4 would be subjected to terminal conditioning in front of government officials as proof of the necessity and effectiveness of his elimination protocols. Mary Patterson, who had survived through a combination of physical resilience and psychological cunning, realized that Crane's plan to demonstrate his methods publicly would likely result in the deaths of all 7 remaining children. More importantly, she understood that if Crane succeeded in convincing territorial authorities to adopt his methods, hundreds of other children would suffer the same fate, despite months of systematic conditioning designed to eliminate all resistance. Mary retained enough of her original moral clarity to recognize that she had to act. On the night of July 16th, while Crane was preparing documents for his presentation to territorial authorities, Mary made a desperate decision that would change everything. Using skills she had learned during her months of survival at Riverside, Mary managed to slip out of the locked dormitory and make her way to Crane's office. Her plan was simple but dangerous: steal Crane's detailed logs and escape to Springfield to alert authorities about what was happening at Riverside. She knew that her chances of survival during a 30-mile journey across hostile territory were minimal, but she also knew that staying meant certain death for herself and the other surviving children. What Mary discovered in Crane's office exceeded her worst expectations. The logs she found detailed not only the systematic murder of 40 children, but comprehensive plans for expanding his conditioning protocols to charitable institutions throughout the Illinois Territory. Crane had prepared detailed recommendations for territorial authorities, including systematic procedures for eliminating unsuitable children and using survivors to staff future conditioning programs. But most horrifying was Crane's correspondence with what appeared to be other individuals interested in his methods. The letters, written in code but partially decipherable, suggested that Crane was part of a larger network of individuals who believed that American children needed to be systematically subjected to trauma and violence to prepare them for frontier life. Names mentioned in the correspondence included officials in at least 3 other territorial institutions. Mary's attempt to escape with the documents was discovered when Crane made his nightly inspection of the dormitories. Finding her missing, He immediately searched the building and discovered her in his office, stuffing papers into a bag she had constructed from torn clothing. His response was swift and brutal. Mary was subjected to immediate emergency conditioning designed to extract information about any other children who might have assisted her escape attempt. Under torture that lasted through the night, Mary revealed nothing about accomplices because there were none. Her escape attempt had been entirely individual, but Crane's paranoia convinced him that Mary's resistance indicated that his conditioning of the surviving children had been incomplete. His July 17th log entry shows his decision to implement total reconditioning protocols for all remaining children. Subject M. Patterson's attempted sabotage indicates fundamental conditioning failure across all remaining subjects. Will implement complete reconditioning beginning immediately. All subjects will undergo terminal conditioning and replacement subjects will be acquired for proper program implementation. Mary Patterson's torture and planned murder triggered the first organized resistance among the surviving children since Crane had assumed control of Riverside. Samuel Harrison, who had been psychologically broken and had participated in the torture and murder of other children for months, experienced what can only be described as a moral awakening when he witnessed Mary's systematic destruction. On the morning of July the 18th, as Crane prepared to begin the terminal reconditioning of all remaining children, Samuel made a desperate choice. Using a knife he had stolen from the kitchen, he attacked Crane while the superintendent was preparing instruments for Mary's continued torture. The attack was not successful. Crane's military training allowed him to overpower the weakened 15-year-old boy, but it created enough chaos for Mary and two other children to escape the main building. Samuel Harrison died during his attack on Crane, but his sacrifice provided the opportunity that saved the remaining children and exposed the truth about Riverside. Mary Patterson, despite severe injuries from her torture, managed to reach the main road with 8-year-old Lucy Chen and 10-year-old Robert Adams. The three children were discovered the following day by a territorial militia patrol and brought to Springfield, where Mary's testimony led to immediate investigation of Riverside Children's Home. When territorial authorities arrived at Riverside on July 22nd, they found Josiah Crane in his office calmly completing his final log entry. The 4 children who had been unable to escape during Samuel's diversionary attack were dead, killed during what Crane's logs describe as accelerated terminal conditioning, implemented after the escape of the other children. Crane offered no resistance to arrest and seemed genuinely confused by the authorities' characterization of his actions as criminal. During interrogation, he repeatedly insisted that he had been implementing necessary conditioning protocols designed to prepare children for frontier survival. His complete psychological break from reality was evident in his continued belief that territorial authorities would recognize the value of his methods once they understood his systematic approach. The territorial investigation revealed the full scope of the horror that had occurred at Riverside. 45 children had died between December 1811 and July 1812, not from disease, accident, or natural causes, but through systematic torture and murder implemented by a man who had convinced himself that cruelty was education. The investigation also uncovered evidence of correspondence with other individuals interested in similar conditioning methods, leading to a broader investigation that exposed a network of frontier institutions where systematic child abuse was being implemented under the guise of preparation for adult life. Josiah Crane was executed by territorial authorities in August 1812, but the damage he had inflicted extended far beyond the children he had murdered. The 3 surviving children, Mary Patterson, Lucy Chen, and Robert Adams, were so severely traumatized that they required years of care before they could function in normal society. Mary Patterson's detailed testimony preserved in territorial archives provided the primary evidence used to convict Crane and exposed the broader network of institutional abuse. The Riverside Children's Home was permanently closed, and the building was eventually demolished in 1847, but the documents discovered during renovation in 1987 revealed that the property had been abandoned for decades before demolition, with local residents reporting strange sounds and unexplained phenomena that kept them away from the site. Whether these reports reflected genuine supernatural activity or simply the psychological impact of knowing what had occurred there, the property remained uninhabited for over 30 years after Crane's execution. The broader investigation triggered by Mary Patterson's testimony led to reforms in territorial oversight of charitable institutions and the establishment of inspection protocols designed to prevent similar abuses. But the network of individuals inspired by Crane's methods was never fully exposed, and historians have documented evidence of similar systematic abuse at frontier institutions well into the 1840s. The psychological impact of the Riverside horror extended beyond the immediate victims to the entire concept of institutional child care on the frontier. Public trust in charitable institutions was severely damaged, leading to increased reliance on family-based care and apprenticeship systems that often left orphan children with fewer protections than they had possessed under the institutional system. Dr. Chen's modern analysis of the Riverside documents concluded that Crane's systematic abuse represented one of the earliest documented examples of institutional child torture designed for ideological rather than personal motives. Crane was not a sadist in the conventional sense. Dr. Chen observed he was an ideological terrorist who used children as subjects in an experiment designed to create superior human beings through trauma. The systematic nature of his abuse and his detailed documentation suggest that he viewed himself as conducting scientific research rather than committing crimes. The most disturbing aspect of the Riverside case, according to Dr. Chen, was evidence that Crane's methods were being studied and potentially implemented by other individuals during the same period. The correspondence found in his office suggested a network of frontier educators and institutional administrators who believed that systematic trauma was necessary for proper child development. While most of this network was never fully investigated due to the limited law enforcement resources of territorial authorities, documented evidence suggests that similar abuses occurred at institutions in at least 4 other territories. The final entry in Crane's logs, written on the morning of his arrest, provides insight into the mind of a man who had systematically murdered 45 children while convinced that he was saving them. Program implementation concludes today with arrival of territorial representatives. 45 subjects successfully eliminated for insufficient survival capacity. 7 subjects achieved basic conditioning requirements. 3 subjects demonstrated advanced survival capacity and will provide foundation for expanded program implementation. Results confirm effectiveness of systematic conditioning protocols for frontier readiness development. Even facing execution, Crane never expressed remorse for his actions or acknowledged that what he had done was morally wrong. His final statement to territorial authorities was a request that his methods be studied and implemented at other institutions, since he believed his research had proven the necessity of systematic trauma for proper child development. This mystery shows us how easily institutional authority can become a shield for systematic evil, and how the isolation of frontier life could allow horrors to continue unchecked for months or years. The children who died at Riverside were not victims of accident or disease. They were murdered by a system that valued ideology over humanity and authority over compassion. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of American history holds many secrets still waiting to be uncovered, and we'll continue bringing them to light, one terrifying truth at a time. See you in the next video.